Next up, we have the Fundamental Ecology Award winner from last year up to present the results of her work. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Nicole Bezemer, who's from University of Western Australia. And is somewhere lost?
Hello. Thank you, and sorry. Oh, wicked.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Awesome. I'll pop that over there. Okay. Oh, I need my pointer. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm extremely pleased to present to you today some results of my PhD research on the magnificent Eucalyptus caesia. Eucalyptus caesia is a long-lived lignotuberous tree that is pollinated by birds and which occurs exclusively on granite outcrops in the southwest of Western Australia. Granite outcrops are globally significant biodiverse hotspots for both plants and animals. There are also places of immense cultural significance. On that note, I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge that many of these rocks are of immense cultural importance for Indigenous Australians in the area. This includes significance as both places to live, being like providing water resources in an often dry landscape. It also extends to spiritual significance. In this photo, we can see my supervisor, Steve Hopper, who is pointing out the footprint of Spirit Woman, which was embedded in the rock as she ran across the landscape. Onto my study species, Eucalyptus caesia. The map shows the distribution across the wheatbelt region of Western Australia, which is the main area in which wheat and sheep are produced. It is known from 27 small, scattered granite populations across an area of around 300 by 400 kilometres. It has large pink flowers that are predominantly pollinated by birds as the native pollinator, and there are two subspecies described. Shown in the black dots on the map are Eucalyptus caesia subspecies caesia populations. This subspecies is distinguished by having larger plants, relatively small flowers, but more numerous flowers per plant. In contrast, subspecies magna is the more rare of the two subspecies. It is restricted to the northeast of the species' natural distribution. It has relatively smaller plants with larger flowers and also fewer flowers. An important concept to get through about Eucalyptus caesia is that these isolated outcrop populations are anciently fragmented rather than recently fragmented. And we know this from earlier work by Steve Hopper and Margaret Byrne. So what they found is that the species has existed or persisted as very small populations for hundreds of thousands of years. This photo shows a tree at Mount Caroline. In the distance, we can see another granite outcrop, and that outcrop has around 17 plants of caesia as well. Although it's anciently fragmented, it's not necessarily free from the effects of recent habitat fragmentation, and I'd just like you to bear that in mind. Some of these are agricultural impacts, for example, the clearing of granite outcrops to the base of the rock. Some of these are recreational destruction, for example, this golf course on Pingreen. Pingreen Rock has just 3 Eucalyptus caesia plants. Caesia can reproduce asexually via lignotubary sprouting and also sexually, although sexual reproduction is extremely rare and has only been seen recently in 2 out of 27 populations after wildfire. The research topics that I've focused on for my PhD are listed here. You can ask me about them later if you so desire, but today I'll just be focusing on the first topic, talking to you about the results of my landscape genetic analysis. So my methods were to go out to 17 populations of caesia across its range. I collected altogether 2,400 leaf samples and then genotyped them using 14 microsatellite loci. This allowed me to really look at both fine-scale population genetics as well as genetic structure across the landscape at a landscape scale. An example of what this looks like, the little dots show the location of individual plants, and I did that for all of my study populations. Just a few more photos. One of my favorite sites has to be Mount Sterling. After I sampled from there, I emailed my supervisor to say I'd been to Mount Sterling, and he replied, "Nicole, you have walked on the back of the giant serpent known as Mulak." So that was quite a privilege. On to some results. One of my findings was that populations of E. caesia have in fact been grossly overestimated, and this is largely due to their capacity for asexual reproduction. So they have extensive localized clonality. Populations are extremely small. As you can see from this table, this column shows the census population size measured as the number of genets or the number of unique multilocus genotypes in my sample. There are quite a few populations with fewer than 10 plants. At some locations, there is only a single plant remaining. The largest population has just under 600 plants, and despite this, Eucalyptus caesia is not declared rare flora. Onto some results of my genetic work. Over here, you're looking at a principal coordinates analysis, and each point is an individual tree that I sampled, and they are color-coded for their source populations. So what jumps out immediately is the really strong clustering of my populations, and that really supports the earlier work by Steve and Margaret. Another obvious feature of this plot is that the two sides of the plot correspond to the two subspecies, with Magna over here and caesia over here. How do these genetic relationships match up with the geographic location of these populations is an interesting question. So when Steve and Margaret did their sampling, they sampled very widely across the species distribution, but they did not sample from very many pairs of neighbouring populations. Although similar to Steve and Margaret, I found no significant overall effect of isolation by distance. By sampling close neighbouring pairs, we do actually see that some close neighbours are in fact genetically related. In contrast, some close neighbours, which are less than 10 kilometres apart, are very strongly genetically differentiated. To put some numbers to that, Mount Caroline and Mount Sterling, which are located within a few kilometres, have a relatively low level of pairwise population differentiation at a GST of 0.18. In contrast, Old Muntudgeon and Chinga Hills, located within a stone's throw from each other, are incredibly strongly differentiated. These results led me to wonder what would happen if I went and sampled additional populations. And mostly I was interested in this area in the northeast. So I went out and sampled additional populations, including Walliamonning, Yannimonning, and additional populations representing subspecies Magna. So I wanted to test whether I'd get a similar result with that clear division, genetic division, between the two subspecies. What I found was rather interesting. I'll start off by pointing out the population of Bezemer, which is recognized as subspecies caesia, and it sits indeed in this plot on the right side, but morphologically, Bezemer has the short stature, large leaves, and large fruit that more closely resemble subspecies Magna. Chinga Hills is also subspecies caesia, but in this ordination plot, you see it creeping over towards the Magna side. Walliamoning, the most northeasterly population of subspecies caesia, has a foot in both sides, having affinity with both subspecies caesia and subspecies Magna. And then the population just below it, Yanimoning, which is also quite geographically close to the subspecies Magna populations, is sitting here, Yanimoning there, almost entirely on the subspecies Magna side. So these are quite curious results because it points at an incongruence between what we have recognized as a morphological species and what the genetic data show. There is definitely more work to be done in this space, but some potential explanations for these results are maybe incomplete speciation or even maybe hybridization. One of Steve Hopper's hypotheses are that Yanimoning is potentially one of the source populations from which subspecies Magna was derived, and these results could support that hypothesis. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. Well, I'm actually nearly done. Okay, I'll just go on to my key conclusions. So my study has shown that most of these populations have a unique genetic identity. And even going to the really small populations comprised of fewer than 10 plants, even single plants, I found unique alleles in those populations. What this means from a conservation perspective is that the number of conservation units for the species should probably roughly equate to the number of rocks upon which Eucalyptus caesia grows. And even very small populations and individual trees do in fact contribute to overall species genetic diversity. I found potential for incongruence between morphology and genetics in the classification and division between the two subspecies, and this is an area that needs further investigation. Importantly, these very strongly differentiated populations may be on different evolutionary trajectories, and this needs to be considered in future conservation and genetic management. I'd like to end by thanking my three amazing supervisors, Dave Roberts, Ziggy Kraus, and Steve Hopper, as well as a lot of funding bodies, especially Ecological Society of Australia. And I'll end on a positive note with the overall conclusion of my thesis. The proud conqueror held firmly in Langa may thrive beyond mankind. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah. Where what, sorry?
Do you look at the impact of fire on one of
Yes, absolutely.
Did that wipe out one of these areas?
No. So there was a fire at Boyajan Rock in 2016, which indeed burnt through much of the population. But after visiting that population, so I documented seedlings that came up after the fire, and within a year after the fire, most of the adults had resprouted. But after that fire, I found around 120 seedlings, and I followed their growth and survival over the next a year and a half. And at the end of the survey, there were about 30 seedlings remaining. That's actually quite a substantial expansion of the population because that location had around 175 plants. So the addition of 30 is pretty good. Any other questions? Yes, Greg.
Hello, Nikki.
Hi, Greg.
This species loves granite outcrops. The granite outcrops are separated by large areas of sandplain or laterite or something.
There's a lot in the between, but you see, there are also many, many other granite outcrops in between the existing populations.
So I suppose I'm asking, what's the mechanism for connectivity about what are potentially a series of islands?
That's a good question. So Eucalyptus caesia, like most eucalypts, appears to have mostly gravity dispersed seed. So how is it possible that these seeds could move among these granite outcrops? There are a few ideas that have been put out there. One is that really large wildfires across the landscape could potentially transport propagules. They could be transported also during floods. The wheat belt is prone to quite substantial flooding, where you get large areas that are inundated. That could also possibly transport seed. I'll add to that the distance between populations may have been substantially less over the very long evolutionary history of the species. So there could have been less distance to cover in between outcrops. Does that answer your question?
Sure, why not?
Okay, I tried.
Its conservation status, you mentioned it wasn't listed in WA or nationally, and what's your...
Okay, so the species only occurs naturally in Western Australia. And although the two species, the subspecies have been described, recently, well not recently, a few years back, Florabase decided to no longer recognise those subspecies. And so since they've now been combined, it's not recognised as declared flora. But there was no basis for no longer recognising the subspecies.
As in it doesn't meet criteria?
No, there have been no scientific publications to prove that the subspecies are not valid. It was just a decision that came out of the herbarium. Yeah. I agree with you, absolutely.
Okay, we might need to wrap it up there. So thanks again.
Thank you.